And we're live. 7th and 8th grade. How are you guys doing? Hope you're having a good start to the week, man. Finishing strong. Today we're going to look at some pages from the history textbook, which I'm not super a fan of, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that what happens when you're an educator is sometimes you'll try to simplify things for a younger audience. Not that you guys aren't capable of understanding, but try to get the essential facts across, but in the process sometimes I think that they almost make things more complicated because they just don't have enough information to really help us understand what we need to understand. And so today we're kind of following up our discussion of imperialism and isolationism, those two different kind of foreign policies we talked about. But we're going to talk today more specifically about Hawaii becomes a territory. That's easy, yeah. You should know Hawaii becomes a territory. But then they have all this section on page 694 and 695 where they go over some serious stuff in the span of 4 or 5 paragraphs. And it's just I remember reading this, with my 7th and 8th graders years ago, and it's what? There needs to be some unpacking if we're going to really understand it. So let's talk about the two major terms that they used in this reading. They use something called spheres of influence, which is a simple concept. We can break that down. A sphere, like a circle, an area of influence. So a sphere of influence would be like a foreign nation coming to a new nation or area and having influence over the trade and politics of a particular area. To give you an example, let's say that some folks from Kentucky came and opened up, a store in Ripley, Ohio, and had a real monopoly on the market. They would kind of have a sphere of influence in the state of Ohio. From Kentucky coming to a new place, having a sphere of influence, an area of influence in politics, economics, politics. I think I said politics already, but that's what they mean by spheres of influence. So tuck that away, and then we'll come back to that in a second. They also talked about the Opendoor Policy, which is basically the idea that we shouldn't have spheres of influence, that everybody should have kind of a free or equal access to a particular area. And we'll talk about how those two terms relate to the subject matter. But the first thing we need to know is that during this time, we're really talking about Japan, China, and Korea right now, okay? So we talk about how, number one thing, Japan is becoming more progressive as a nation. They're becoming less of an isolationist country, and they're actually starting to get involved in world politics and affairs and trade, etc. Japan, long story short, during this time in history is becoming more modernized, right? We see that in their trade, in their military, in their industry, etc. So that's one thing to know. Japan is becoming more modernized. Now, how does this affect us? Because we're talking about China, okay? And spheres of influence in China. Well, it affects us because Japan and China, they mentioned very briefly here that there is a conflict between Japan and China. But why? They didn't give us a whole lot of other information on that. Well, Japan during this time was very interested in controlling modern day Korea, North and South Korea. And the reason for this was because it was, if you look at a map, you have Japan, Korea, China. It's a strategic location for them as far as trade and naval strategy goes. So they were interested in controlling Korea. They kind of butt heads with the Chinese over this, and ultimately what transpires is a conflict between Japan and China over this Korean territory. It's not actually a territory, but that area. And this really weakens the Chinese because the Chinese are not as during this time they're not as modernized as the Japanese in regard to their trade and their warfare, their weaponry, etc. So it really weakens China. And China ultimately becomes open, like we said, to spheres of influence. You have a Japanese presence in China with a stake in trade logistics and location, and then over time more nations come in. America, Great Britain, etc., Russia, and they have an influence over China, and from an economic standpoint, and that's really something that the people in China really don't like that. There's a great pushback on that. They talk about the Boxer Rebellion, which was an event. You could read up on this in the textbook, or even watch another YouTube video better explaining it. But the Boxer Rebellion was essentially against a foreign influence, spheres of influence in China, and they wanted to get back to a more native sort of Chinese culture and civilization, free from the influences of other nations. And the Boxer Rebellion, excuse me, the Boxer Rebellion is really kind of finally stamped out, and the nation China is required to pay reparations, which you guys know probably from our discussion last year of like World War II and stuff. Reparations where you pay to compensate for the damages that you did, in this case the rebellion, and it really cripples China's economy and their financial standpoint, and it takes them a long time to finally recover from that. So I hope that kind of helps you guys think through this a little bit. The Opendoor Policy is a consequence of that too, where they say, okay, well, we're not going to have nations controlling access to trade in China, or we're going to open it up. And that was something that transpires after they've kind of already crippled China's economy. Hope that it helps out a little bit. Spheres of influence, an area of influence from a foreign nation in a particular area. The Japanese Chinese conflict that kind of led to these spheres of influence, and then consequently led to the Boxer Rebellion. I hope that kind of helped you guys think through that Japan was interested in controlling modern day North and South Korea, and the Chinese were resistant to that, which ultimately resulted in a conflict, which consequently led to spheres of influence because of China's weakened stability as a country. Okay, hope you guys got something out of that. Rock and roll as always. Miss you guys. Hope you're having a great day. Talk soon.